But this sort of thing happens all the time, and this is kind of the benefit of having data from a coach's perspective, is when our riders are complaining that, I'm not getting any faster, I'm weak in this, and I should be strong in this, or just for whatever reason things aren't going as that rider would like them to go. We can actually peek at the data and say, well, here's why. Here are a number of reasons why, or at least why we think why. First off, and this doesn't relate to the lack of performance in the short power realm, but we did notice it's been quite some time since Scott has reassessed. And that's not the biggest deal if you're progressing your training in some way. It seems like he's riding quite a lot outside. That's worrisome in its own ways, because we know the more people ride outside, the more they get away from structure. Yep. Typically, that doesn't benefit them. But when you postpone your reassessment for quite some time and there's been some improvement, and that's going to impact further workouts, especially when they're scaled to FTP and your FTP hasn't changed. So you might not be receiving the intended benefits because you're not working as hard as we intend, or the training plans or the workouts intend. Can
I rephrase that from like a visual perspective that helps me to think of that? So let's say that your threshold is actually higher than it is. Power zones are not entirely arbitrary. And what I mean by that is that when you lay out a power zone, it's not like we're just saying it's X percentage of your threshold and that's what it is, but certain things happen at your body or in your body at certain intensities relative to your threshold, right? So when we're talking about putting you in a specific spot to train, if you don't have an accurate fix on where you're at with your threshold, then you may not be getting the intended benefits of that workout because you're not spending the time necessary in that zone.
Could be working a little too hard. Most likely you're working a little too easy because your fitness has improved, but you're still working at these same percentages. So you're not actually driving adaptation. You're not providing a sufficient stimulus.
Yeah, so that's why we've talked about, assessing as frequently as a plan suggests, which is usually every 4 to 6 weeks. Or if you feel that you need to reassess, whether because you feel it's too hard or too easy, the ramp test makes it really easy to do that. You can also take different approaches. Like, for example, if you feel like you're on a good trajectory, we talked, I think, last week about upping it 3 to 5 watts every few weeks, something like that. You can try that. I would recommend with those sort of tactics, you really have to have a good fix on your body and what's going on.
Yeah, it's better reserved for more experienced riders who understand that, no, that just made that workout too hard.
Yeah, and you really have to be able to filter through the variables, because you have to understand if it was just the bad food that you had the night before or the bad sleep that's affecting it.
Yeah, sure.
Plenty of things. But that's why we feel like it's critical. And in this case, it does seem like...
reasons.
Yeah.
Another is that the longer you postpone this reassessment, you're getting an inflated TSS value. So you're actually not doing quite as much work as TSS is crediting you for, because your threshold is higher. So it's interpreting workouts as you doing more work, jacking up your TSS, which means at the end of the week you have a higher value, which is not a big deal until it is. Because eventually when you do reassess and now your FTP is accurate, your TSS, your weekly TSS, your weekly training stress is going to plummet. And that can send some people into a training spiral where they think, oh, I'm not doing enough. And now, even though they're effectively doing more work than they had been doing, their TSS isn't accurately it is now accurately representing it, giving them the impression that they're not doing as much TSS. And they'll probably try to correct that in a manner I wouldn't suggest, one that's not going to further performance.
Yeah, I can totally see that. That's really common to see. So in this case, it does kind of look like he probably is, I guess, training or riding at a lower intensity than he probably should. Perhaps. Yeah.
What we notice is he's doing a ton of outdoor rides, and they're done at moderate intensity.
Right.
So we've talked a lot of times about no man's land training and tempo being that. Tempo isn't that, but when all you do is tempo, it becomes that. So, and it looks like that's kind of the rut he's fallen into. He's not really doing any long, slow stuff, and he's not really doing any high intensity stuff. He's just kind of riding moderately. And it's not to say he's without any of those things. He's touching on those things, but he's not doing enough of them to stimulate the sort of performance changes he's looking for.
Yeah, it looks like very rarely there are very short spikes in these rides that he does. Very short spikes that may go to 400 to 500, and that's it. And it's for a very short period of time.
And that's not going to do anything anyways. It's just not enough. It's not an intense enough affair to spur what he's looking for.
Yeah, and what I'm getting at with that is I don't want that to come across as any sort of an insult. What I'm getting at is just what Chad's saying. If you keep doing the same thing that you're doing, it just,
it's kind of rider you become.
Yeah, exactly right. And if you aren't stepping outside of those bounds, you can't expect to be proficient outside of those bounds.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then on top of it, this sort of riding can lead to a high level of residual fatigue. So basically you're always carrying some level of fatigue, which doesn't lend itself to neuromuscular power, which we're going to talk a lot about in a minute here, and even anaerobic power. those things suffer when you're carrying a bit of what's really a central limitation. And I know in the past I've referred to peripheral adaptation and central adaptation, peripheral being in the muscles, central being in the heart, lungs. I'm going to try to get away from that because it gets a little confusing, because typically these days when we talk about central limitation, we're talking about the brain.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start referring to the other, what I used to call central, as cardiopulmonary or cardiovascular, or just be a little more specific. So right now we're talking about more fatigue can actually limit you centrally, or lead to central limitation. So your brain just won't let you recruit high amounts of muscle because it's in a protective sort of mode, because it recognizes a certain level of fatigue, et cetera. And then total side note, well, not total side note, but a minor thing to consider is that vitamin D deficiency can lend to decreases in neuromuscular response and power. So, and a lot of riders are vitamin D deficient. And I know Nate's talked about before being in the sun a lot. He's like, I spent tons of time in the sun, yet I'm still vitamin D deficient. Well, if you're slathering on sunscreen, it's no surprise. You're not getting the benefit of the sun when you're working against it in that manner.
So let's talk about the neuromuscular side of things, like that short power and training, that sort of a thing.
Yeah, and this is what I think is what's going on here. And it's for this reason that I like riders to include some of this year round. I don't want them to reserve it to the last possible minute. I think that's more appropriate for advanced athletes who recognize they can cultivate that power quickly, and they don't want that sort of fatigue when they're trying to accumulate high mileage. So when you get to the elite level or an advanced level, that's probably a more appropriate approach than it is for a rider who can only train 6 to 8 hours a week and needs to vary their training in such a way that they're maintaining and building certain systems at different times. So I like at least one workout per week, and if not a workout dedicated to it, at least portions of a workout dedicated to it. And you'll see this a lot in the sweet spot base too. Once you've worked through establishing a good level of muscle endurance, start working in little 5-second and 12-second sprints, or we'll kick off an interval with a high intensity effort, or start sprinkling in some microbursts or that sort of thing.
I think I have one of those workouts today. I'm kind of scared about it, but I've got race start intervals and everything else is junction -1. So if anybody's a TrainerRoad user, you can check that out.
That's a perfect example.
Yep.
And then in his case also, in Scott's case, people often say, well, I'm built a certain way. I have a certain fiber composition and this is my limitation. That's just not an argument that really holds water. Everything I've read over the years, and I tried to find something specific, couldn't, but I know it's out there, is that our fiber composition in our legs, let's talk legs specifically, starts at roughly 50-50. I mean, it's a pretty even blend between fast twitch and slow twitch fibers. A lot of resources will back this up. So I feel it's safe to say endurance training over literally years and even decades might shift that balance, but we're talking maybe to like a 60-40 thing. It's not like you suddenly are so completely aerobic. That doesn't happen.
Right.
And then the flip side of that is that with strength training, you can definitely cultivate fiber transition. So you can go from your intermediate twitch, you can bump them up to more fast twitch. And that's kind of one of the downsides and why endurance training and strength training don't mix really well. And then when you detrain, your slow twitch fibers become more anaerobic. So your slow twitch fibers become more fast twitch. Not desirable from an endurance perspective, certainly. It's just kind of a bummer, but the body doesn't need that aerobic power, so it starts to basically kill it off. And then fiber type composite, or that switch that I said from fast twitch to slow twitch is more likely a change from your your fast twitch fibers back to your intermediate fibers.
Okay.
So even then, it's not this, you're going to take a fast twitch fiber and change it all the way to the characteristics of a slow twitch fiber. It's a little subtler than that.
Right.
And it's thought to be minimal. I mean, it's still argued whether this happens or not. And it's probably the strongest argument against it is that what is the most malleable is our mitochondrial content. So our aerobic capacity within each cell, whether it's within each muscle cell or muscle fiber, regardless of whether it's slow twitch or fast twitch. And what was really interesting is one study in particular pointed out that the content of the mitochondria in the fast twitch muscles, so our strength muscles, was twice as high as a mitochondrial content in the slow twitch muscles, the more aerobic muscles of untrained athletes.
Wow.
So highly trained athletes are chock full of mitochondria, even at their so-called strength fibers.
Yeah. So even take whatever fiber composition you have, we're really talking about mitochondrial density and efficiency at that level.
That's the argument against it, yeah. And it's not even an argument against it. It's true. So they're saying that it's really changes in mitochondria, not actually changes in the fiber and other changes in the constitution of each type of fiber.
I feel like with you, Pete, prior to becoming a pro cyclist or racing pro criteriums, because I guess technically you're just a Cat 1.
Just a Cat 1.
Just a Cat 1, measly Cat 1. I know that you were like, I'm a sprinter, because against the people that you were racing against, you were an effective sprinter, right? And then there came a shift, I'm sure at some point, you've mentioned this before, but a shift where you're like, I guess I'm not a sprinter, at least at this, the most elite level in the country.
A high level sprinter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can still put out good sprint numbers. If we're riding around the block, I can beat most people in a sprint. But in a race, I'm not that kind of sprinter.
I question too whether you are or not, because you're kind of along the lines of Scott. I don't know how much training you do in terms of neuromuscular response. Because if you did target that, could you actually cultivate a pretty mean kick?
And I used to sprint a lot more when I was winning races by sprinting.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So
that's how it goes, right?
It's a cycle, and we're gonna try to sprint more around here, right?
Yeah, we are. On Wednesdays.
This folds in perfectly to the next one.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
if you don't train it, it's not magically there.
Yeah.
Not typically. There are some riders who are predisposed to certain types of riding, and that may be a natural strength of theirs, but it doesn't mean, you were naturally a good sprinter until you weren't, until you reached that point where the people who were also naturally good sprinters actually trained their sprints and became really good sprinters, which left you in the dust, left you to pursuing different strategies, different tactics.
Yep.
So there's a thing called the Henneman size principle, which just basically says you'll recruit fibers in the order of the force demand. So whatever load is placed on the muscle, you'll start with the most easily recruitable and the weakest, relatively speaking, fibers, and work your way up.
Gotcha.
So there has to be a big demand on the muscle to even recruit the fibers that you're trying to train. And in Scott's case, he's not doing that. So why would they be active? Why would they be contributing to the workload at any point?
Yeah,
they're never being communicated.
If they're never fired. Why would you ever work them? Right.
So you have to train neuromuscularly. You have to strengthen that connection between your brain and your muscles, and you have to do it in a manner that becomes increasingly specific to what you want to achieve. You can't just go out and do hard 30-second sprints and expect to have really high 5-second power, and vice versa.
Yep. Yeah. It's interesting because when you talk about like 60, 120, 240-minute efforts, there's much less change. But then when we talk about, the shorter the duration, the more granular it becomes, the more variable in terms of the demand on your body. Like you said, 30 to 50-second sprints, very different deals, right?
Yes.
So what sort of, let's talk about the actual training to bring about this sort of adaptation.
So let's first talk about what we're trying to achieve. What this neuromuscular adaptation entails, and then we'll talk about how you go about achieving it.
All for it.
So again, neuromuscular training, we're just talking about how well the brain and the muscles communicate. So when we train neuromuscularly, the type of training, that specific type of training, what we're going to talk about in a minute, a number of things happen. And one of them is that you increase muscle fiber recruitment. There are just fibers that were dormant, that weren't being communicated with, are sitting there underutilized or unutilized. So we try to establish those lines of communication so that we can recruit them. So that effectively increases the motor unit pool. So more muscle fibers are ready and willing.
Got it.
And then those motor units or those fibers actually get stronger. That's obviously not a bad thing in terms of maximum power. And you actually can probably more via strength training than on the bike training, but increase the number of fibers. So achieve a level of hyperplasia where you're actually adding muscle fibers. And then there's, I can't remember if this is the exact term, but motor unit cycling. And basically what it is, whether that's the right term or not, is that the more fibers you have, the better the more endurance you're going to have, even at high power, or especially in this case at high power levels. So the fiber fatigues, it drops out of play. Other fibers come in to replace it because, again, you have a wider or a vaster pool of muscle fibers. So increased endurance.
Spreads the load, so to speak.
Yes, exactly right. And then there's less neural activity necessary. So your brain basically doesn't have to work as hard. So it's greater efficiency. And that's an important thing. I mean, both in terms of central load and how much it takes your head out of the game, and in terms of even glucose use for your brain. Your brain's a glucose hog. And so if we can trim some of that usage a bit, that's going to benefit what's available for the muscles.
And I think of like the most brainless moves that I've seen on a bicycle, and they're always during a sprint. It's like when people start sprinting, it just turns off, and then just
if there's any time you need to be sharp, it's during a sprint. And then you can increase the fiber synchronization, how well the muscles fire to the very specific end you're trying to achieve, how well they do that particular job. And you can decrease inhibition. So the muscles that would work against those muscles, so the antagonists, get less and less involved in, basically protecting the joint. They learn, this movement pattern is learned so well that they are better and better at turning off and letting the driving muscles do their jobs.
Yeah, you'll see that a lot of the time with a person when they're not used to sprinting and they first start sprinting, you can almost see in their body muscles pulling this way and this way at the same time. And just nothing's coordinated. It happens. And it even happens to me if I go a long time without sprinting.
Fatigue will bring you back to the point of
and fatigue too.
Looking like you don't know how to sprint. Like you never knew how to sprint.
Yeah, so
that's not pretty.
That coordination side of it.
It's called pedaling squares. I mean, it's ugly.
That coordination side of things is really important, but it's also the reason that I'm pointing this specific part out is because I feel like it requires some sort of patience. I feel like a lot of people are whether it's vanity or whether it's just concerned about what other people think of them, whatever, how you want to tie those in. A lot of the time they'll be like, yeah, but I look weird when I sprint, or I don't feel natural, that sort of a thing.
Or they look at someone else and say, he's naturally a good sprinter.
No.
You should have seen the 100 sprints he did before this.
Exactly. At some point, that rider, he or she didn't look great, but said, I've actually got a lot of power. I'm going to work on this. Whether it was a conscious decision or not, they worked on it more and they got really good at it.
Yeah.
And then just another adaptation is something called ratecoating. So an improvement in ratecoating, which is just the how quickly a muscle twitches. So between slow twitch and fast twitch, there's a difference in how quickly the muscle twitches. If you can improve how quickly your fast twitch fibers twitch, the more frequently they twitch, the greater force they can generate. So as that ratecoating goes up, so does your ability to create a lot of power at once. So all of this is just to a single end, and we're trying to teach our muscles to fire more quickly and to do it more forcefully.
Yeah.
And that's where I think Scott's lacking, and that's where anybody who doesn't train a sprint will lack, at least at some point, once they ascend to a point where they're going against people who do train this sort of thing. So the question then becomes, what do you need to do neuromuscularly? And first off, if you're trying to train this sort of response, this sort of brain-muscle communication, it's best to do it with the most, best to limit the amount of fatigue that's on board. So you don't do the hard workouts where you're sprinting and then doing a ton of work and then sprinting and then doing a ton of work. That cultivates capacity, but what we're after here is specific power. So try to limit your in-workout fatigue, and that can just mean long rest between the efforts. It can mean doing a slow, easy ride or recovery ride punctuated with a few sprints. But in any case, you're reasonably fresh for each one of these that rolls around. And then I break it down into, and I think a lot of coaches do, into addressing the three different components. First, you're looking at being able to generate a lot of velocity. And that's either through leg speed drills or something like microbursts, where you're trying to generate a lot of power quickly. You're trying to go from 40% up to 150% and getting all those muscles firing right now. And then turning them off, giving them a brief rest, making them fire really rapidly again. And this is one of the instances where the in-workout fatigue, because we're not ratcheting the fatigue too high, those short recoveries might actually pan out. And then just an example workout for TrainerRoad subscribers is Spanish needle. That's one of the classic.
Anybody who follows me on Strava, see, I probably do Spanish needle, some variation once a week, because I love the workout and I love.
There's so many benefits.
There's so many benefits, and one of my favorite things that all totally makes sense from the neuromuscular adaptation above is I love that I have to be engaged. I have to pay attention the whole time. I don't really watch. I maybe watch bike racing or something or music. It's one of the few workouts where I just work, and I have to be focus. Turned on the whole time.
For sure.
And it feels so good to just wind it up and then rest and wind it up and rest and wind it up.
Which, I mean, even obviously in terms of specialization, when we get to actually racing criteriums, this sort of thing is very necessary. But even way out, even in the base phase, you can weave in some microbursts to really beneficial ends.
Are there, other than Spanish needle, Pete, are there any other specific, and I guess let's talk about like the interval structure. Ones that you have used or prefer?
I really like, most of my racing is really high power and higher rest. So I'm always going for kind of the 140, 150, 160%. I do STAR pretty frequently is one of my favorites too, because I think it's 180%.
Yep.
And it's more spinning your legs. It's getting used to spinning your legs up in 1 or 2 seconds to go from 150 watts to 600 watts, or however that breaks down for you. But the idea is you're quadrupling your power in 1 or 2 seconds, and then you hold on to it, and then you get almost enough rest. But for most people, the way I would think about it is the racing you do, think about the percentages of your FTP that you hang out at. If it's longer, lower duration, like 1 minute at, there's a lot of 1 minute at 130% workouts. Find one that kind of aligns with where you want to be, and then hang out at that percentage.
Be good at it.
Yeah. I think that's you can figure that out too, depending on the sort of race that you plan to do, or how you plan to race it, or how other people plan to race it, and thusly you will have to race it.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, you can get pretty specific on those sort of things.
You absolutely can. And we talked about high velocity right there, so being able to generate a lot of speed. There's also high force, which is kind of what Pete's talking about, where you have to work at really high percentages, obviously for not long durations, because you're not going to be able to, but not just be able to mash the pedals down with a lot of force, but be able to get there quickly. Which is not just force production, but rate of recruitment. How quickly can you get all those muscle fibers on board and generating 150, 180, 200% of your threshold right now? Like 1 second from now, I want to be at that power output.
And that's really one of the root problems that, in this case, Scott's dealing with. And I feel like that's something that comes about with specific training. And if I'm not doing enough specific training, it does take me a while my snap, so to speak, goes away. But my snap comes back when I spend time snapping.
Usually trains pretty quickly. It doesn't take a ton of time. I mean, building your aerobic conditioning takes tons of time, but doing your neuromuscular power, your anaerobic power, that stuff comes along relatively quickly. I mean, in a matter of weeks. So, and then some of the workouts, kind of what Pete's talking about is Black Kawea. So take a look at that one, and it doesn't have to be that workout, but you'll see the type of workout that it is, and then look for something similar. And even sprint workouts work, but these would be the sprint workouts like Fuji or Berryessa or Mountain Thai, or the ones where you do a really hard effort and then you have like 5-6 minutes off, and then you do another one. So lots of rest in between.
One of your newer sprint workouts is Burling.
Yeah, and I'm getting to that. I mean, go ahead.
I won't steal your thunder.
It has a slightly different. It has a slightly different name.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So
I didn't read ahead. So.
Okay. So we talk about velocity and we talk about force. Anytime you couple those two, we're talking power, right? So and when we start talking about power, we're also talking about capacity. And I know it gets a little confusing, but we want to be able to put out a lot of power and do it a lot of times. So great frequency. So we're trying to improve our work capacity and increasingly specific to the types of races in which we take part. And really any of the higher end VO2 max workouts, anytime you're pushing 120% or higher, those all qualify. The reduced amplitude, VO2 max workouts that Jonathan is fond of, where you do 120% for 15 seconds and then you recover at 90%. You're not recovering, but you ride at 90%.
Recover.
And then you do it again and again and again. And I fear this is kind of what Scott's doing. I'm sorry. No, I fear this is what Scott's not doing. This is what he needs to do. He needs to be able to work at an already high level of intensity that he knows he can sustain, but be able to punch above it and return to it, punch above it and return to it. So I think these in particular would work out quite well. And then anaerobic capacity stuff like Pete described, 30 second up to maybe 90 second. And then the microbursts again. And then also those sprint workouts, the new ones I've developed are similar to the other sprint workouts, but the recovery in between them and even the warm-up is super short because we're trying to exhaust resources rather than allow them to fully replenish in between. So we want the first sprint to be real fast, the second sprint to maybe be a little faster but a little more costly, a little more painful. Third one's more painful, and it starts to fall off, but you're still recruiting a whole lot of muscle fiber, and in the case of these, a whole lot of aerobic adaptation.
One of the things that we talked about here in the office sometimes is sprint workouts are really mentally demanding because hugely mentally demanding. So for me, I can't really tack it on to something else. I have to go out with the sole purpose of going as hard as I can for a short period of time and probably only an hour or an hour and a half, and then pack it up and go home, right? Like
they're so daunting that I want to get them done first thing in the day, but I know how much it'll fry me for the remainder of the day. So I reserve them for after work, and I work a 5 a.m. to 1 p.m. sort of work shift. I mean, 1:10. I get home, I'm on the bike because I have to get this workout out of the way because it's all I can think about. It just hangs over my head the whole day.
Yeah, they hang heavy for sure. Can we review
painful stuff?
Can we review some principles of self-analysis kind of within this that I feel like can help people? So one thing is you have to take in every variable you can. So rather than just looking at something and either relying on one specific piece of advice or counsel from one person, instead you should look and try to consider absolutely everything it could be rather than trying to find the one thing that it absolutely is. And I feel like that's a really important thing when you're talking about my training isn't going the way I want it to, or my performance isn't going the way I want it to. Try to find everything that could be attributing rather than trying to find the single golden ticket.
Broaden your perspective. Don't just try to pin it on one thing and settle that it's got to be that thing.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. And then from there, I feel like it's easier once you have all those things on the table, as it were, it's easy to then work through them and try to see which one has the most science, logic, evidence, whatever else you want to say behind it to try to get down to the bottom of things. And this can be tough, especially, with limited knowledge or familiarity, but with time, you'll become better at this as long as you take that approach of making sure that you don't jump to conclusions just based off of one quick thing that somebody else has said. And then the other thing with self-analysis is and we've said this plenty of times in the past 10, 15 minutes here, but it's so important to understand that if you are looking for performance that you aren't training for, you have to keep that as an asterisk item when you're considering why you may not be able to perform that way. If you aren't training that way, it simply isn't going to happen. You shouldn't expect it to happen, at least. So those are two really, really important things that I feel like people should understand.
And one thing that Jonathan mentioned is when you lay all those things out on the table, it might take you a year or two to work through them.
Unfortunate, but true.
Unfortunately, but you can pick one at a time, work your way through, decide whether it's helping you or not. And it takes a long time.
Yeah,
cycling is one of those things where everything takes a long time.
It's not wasted time. That's the good thing, because when you've worked through each one of these things, you've learned something. You've probably trained through something. You've made progress. It's not as if you've just checked something else off the list. Now you have a lot of other things to do. Remember that through that process of training and trying to figure out what's driving the true change that you're going after, you are making progress every time you do that. So, it's something that I feel like I'm constantly doing this for different aspects of my performance, always searching.
Pretty much you do it forever.
Forever a learning process.
And I think that's part of the training process. And I know some people just like to say, tell me what to do, and I'm good. And within reason, that's fine.
Yeah, good till you're not.
Yeah, but I think everybody, no matter what plan they're following everything else, we always talk about how to listen to your body, pay attention to performance, and make these small changes that then make you a better cyclist. So I think that it's a good thing to consider. Yep.